Montana Territory, 1879. The sky was the color of smoke and silence when Galina Avery first saw the cowboy. She stood behind the counter of the dry goods store in Cold Creek, hands folded tight in her apron, eyes lowered like usual. She had been that way since her parents died 5 years ago, quiet, polite, invisible when she could manage it. Folks in town had their opinions. Too shy to marry, they said behind their hands. Pretty thing, but she'd freeze solid before she ever spoke her heart. Galina never corrected them. It was easier that way. The cowboy came in just before closing, boots quiet on the wooden planks, hat in his hands. He was tall, dust-covered, and broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of winter bark and a voice as soft as falling ash. "I need flour, coffee, and whatever you have for saddle sores," he said. "Please." She blinked, startled by the way his voice didn't push or strain, just simple. Respectful, she nodded once and moved to gather the items. He waited without shifting, without fidgeting, without filling the air like most men did. When she set the goods on the counter, he gave her a smile, small but real. "Name's Abram Ellard," he said. "Got a spread out east near Bitterroot Ridge, been riding fence for 2 days. Figured I'd come into town before the snow makes it too hard." She nodded again. "You knew here," he hesitated, then said, "Moved out this spring, got 2 horses and a dog, not much else." That was the end of it. He paid in coin, tipped his hat, and walked out. Galina thought about him the whole evening. Quiet men were rare. Men who did not try to fill her silences were rarer. Over the next 2 weeks he came in 3 more times, always polite, always soft-spoken. Sometimes he would ask her a question about where to find good grazing or if anyone in town made quilts. She never said much, but she listened. And she always noticed how he waited for her answers like they mattered. Then came the freezing night when everything changed. It was mid-November when a boy no older than 7 burst into the store just as Galina was sweeping the last of the dirt from the floor. His face was red from cold, his jacket too thin, and his eyes wide with panic. "Please," he gasped. "My sister, she fell through the ice on the creek. She's stuck. We need help." Galina froze for a second. Then she grabbed her shawl, locked the store, and ran. They followed the boy across the field behind the church, down to the edge of Cold Creek where the ice had cracked wide open. A little girl, maybe 5, clung to the edge, her hands blue, her cries thin and broken. Galina dropped to her knees and reached out, but the girl was too far. Boots thundered behind her. Abram Ellard appeared out of the dark like he had been summoned, rope already in his hands. "I saw you run," he said, breath clouding. "Stand back." Galina stepped aside, heart hammering. Abram tied off the rope to the old fence post, looped the other end around his chest, and crawled out onto the ice. Every groan and creak made Galina flinch. He reached the girl, wrapped her in his arms, and shouted, "Pull!" Galina and the boy yanked with all the strength they had. The rope creaked. The wind howled. Then Abram slid back onto solid ground, the girl coughing in his arms. She was alive. The boy sobbed and threw his arms around his sister. Abram helped Galina bundle the girl in her shawl. Her fingers brushed his cold, steady, strong. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once. No one else was going to. They brought the children to the doctor's house. Their parents had died in the spring, and since then, the 2 had been fending for themselves in a broken-down shack near the edge of town. Galina stayed with them all night, holding the girl's hand while Abram sat quietly by the fire. He did not ask questions. He did not demand anything. He simply stayed. The next morning, Galina walked outside to find him brushing snow off his horse. "You could have died," she said. "So could she," he replied. She looked down at her hands. "Why did you follow me?" He met her eyes. "Because you ran without stopping." "That told me who you are." Galina did not know what to say to that. No one had ever seen her that way, not in all the years she had lived in Cold Creek. She looked at him fully then, really looked. Noticed the way his coat was patched by hand. The way his eyes softened when he looked at her. The way he never pushed her to speak but always listened when she did. "Do you think?" She started, then swallowed. Do you think the children could stay with me for a little while until something better comes? He nodded. They would be lucky. They need someone steady, so do you, she blinked. Do you think I am not? I think you are quiet, he said, but not weak. That night, Galina took the children home. She tucked them into the small spare room behind the kitchen, made stew with what she had, and sat by the fire as snow began to fall. There was a knock at her door. Abram stood there in the cold, holding a box of supplies and a small wool blanket. You forgot this at the doctor's, he said. She took it. Thank you. He turned to leave, then paused. If you want help with the children, with the store, with anything you can ask, she nodded, heart full. I will. He tipped his hat again and she smiled. It was the first real smile she had given anyone in a long time. And it was for him. By early December, the children had stopped flinching at sudden noise. They started sleeping through the night too, curled up beneath quilts Galina had stitched from old feed sacks and scraps of wool. Abram brought firewood twice a week, never asking to stay, never lingering longer than needed, but she began to hope he might. One morning, Galina stood with her sleeves rolled, kneading bread beside the stove while the boy, Nathan, practiced his letters by the window. The girl, Lottie, hummed while winding yarn into balls. Snow pressed against the panes, thick and slow falling. There were no customers that day, just the scent of yeast and the hush of slow work. When Abram knocked, Galina didn't startle. She dried her hands, opened the door, and stepped aside without a word. He carried a pair of rabbit pelts and a sack of dried beans. Caught these near the ridge, figured you could use both. We can, she said. Stay a moment, he hesitated, then stepped inside, brushing his coat free of snow. The warmth of the kitchen closed around him. Nathan looked up but said nothing. Lottie offered a smile, then returned to her yarn. Galina poured a mug of coffee from the pot and handed it to him. You trap much? Some. I was raised on it. My uncle ran lines from Missouri all the way to the Platte when I was a boy. He took a sip, then added, taught me not to waste a thing. You don't seem the kind to waste much, she said, his eyes lifted to meet hers. Nor you. Nathan cleared his throat. Mr. Ellard, you ever break a horse? Abram nodded. Plenty. Why? There's a young one in the paddock behind the church. Belongs to the blacksmith's nephew, but it throws anyone who gets close. I'll take a look, Abram said. Tomorrow, if the weather eases. The boy's grin was quick, unguarded. Thanks. Galina didn't speak until Nathan returned to his letters. They trust you. They ought to trust you more, Abram said. She looked down, brushing flour from her apron. I'm still learning how to be sure of things. You're doing more than most would. He left not long after, but the warmth lingered well past him. That night, when the children slept, Galina sat at the kitchen table with a candle burning low. She opened the ledger from the store, started listing what was needed before the supply wagon came through again. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate, but her mind drifted. She thought of how Abram's hands had looked wrapped around the coffee mug, scarred, steady. She thought of the way he listened, not just to words, but to the spaces between them. She'd never met a man who made silence feel like something shared, not something to hide behind. The following week, he returned with an iron kettle mended clean through the cracked bottom. He set it on the counter of the store while she tallied seed packets. Figured you'd need one come stew season, he said. You already brought those beans, she replied. I brought what I had. That ain't always the same as what's needed. She marked a final number, then looked up at him. And what do you need, Abram? He didn't answer right away. He looked at the shelves behind her, the jars, the folded linens, the dust caught in the late sun. Then his gaze returned to hers. I need to know if you mind that I come by, he said. Not for trade. Just to see how you're keeping. She could feel the stillness between them stretch and settle. Her voice was quiet but sure. I don't mind. He nodded once, tipped his hat, left the kettle behind. That evening she placed it on the stove without a word, filled it with water, let it warm the room. Days passed. He came by again, this time with a handful of hard candy for the children and a book of poems he said he didn't have use for. Nathan read one aloud by the fire while Abram sat with his boots off, one knee propped, silent and easy. Galina watched him while she stitched a hem. He fit into the room without taking it over. Like a beam set into place, not flashy or loud, but bearing weight all the same. Later, as she washed dishes in the basin, he stepped beside her. "You've made a home here. I've tried. It shows." She looked at him, the way his eyes didn't wander, the way his words weren't loose or quick. "You always this careful with what you say, only when I mean it." The wind howled outside, shaking the eaves. She dried her hands on her apron. "There's a lot I don't say." "I know," he said, "but I hear it anyway." She didn't speak after that, just reached for the oil lamp, lit it low, and let him stay until the fire burned to embers. She didn't say it, but she hoped he would come again. The sky had cleared by morning, pale and open above the snowbound town. Galina stepped onto the porch with a basket of eggs tucked beneath her shawl, breath rising faintly in the cold. Across the street, two men worked to lift a wagon wheel from a drift, but otherwise Cold Creek kept to its hush. She glanced toward the ridge line beyond the church, where the sun was just beginning to warm the cottonwoods. A quiet knock came from behind as Nathan eased the door open. "There's someone out back," he said, voice low. With a post driver, Galina stepped around the house, boots crunching over the frozen ground. Abram stood along the edge of the fence that wrapped her small paddock, sleeves rolled, arms steady as he drove in a new cedar post. A stack of replacements leaned nearby. "You're early," she said. He looked up, then drove the post full before answering. "Saw the corner give yesterday, thought I'd get ahead of it." "I didn't ask. You didn't need to." She watched him a moment. "You always fix things that don't belong to you," he wiped his brow with the back of one hand. "Only when they matter." He didn't look at her when he said it, but something in the air tightened, like a string pulled taut. She stepped closer, wind catching the hem of her skirt. "I've never had anyone do work for me without expecting something in return. Then those folks missed the point." He picked up another post. She stayed beside him this time, holding it in place while he drove it down. The rhythm of the work steadied her, the sound of wood striking earth. When they reached the final corner, she leaned her weight against it while he tamped the soil. He glanced up. "You ever think about leaving this place?" She hesitated. "Sometimes, but I never had anywhere else to go." He nodded once. "I left Missouri with a saddle and a worn-out mare. Thought maybe I'd find something quiet out here. Did you?" "I found something honest." Galina let go of the post. "I think maybe I did too." That night, she sat with a needle and thread by the hearth while the children played pick-up sticks at her feet. Abram had left before supper, saying he needed to check the water troughs before dark. But something in his voice lingered, like the last note of a song not quite finished. Nathan looked up from the floor. "Is Mr. Ellard your beau?" Galina's needle paused mid-stitch. "Why do you ask? He looks at you different than other folks," he said. "Like he's waiting, but not in a mean way." Lottie tugged at her braid. "He fixed the fence." Galina folded the hem between her fingers. "He's kind." "Are you going to marry him?" Nathan asked. Her heart skipped. "That's not something you decide in a week." "But you could," he said, "if you wanted." She didn't answer. Not then. But when she blew out the lamp that night, she stood at the window for a long while, watching the ridge where the moonlight softened the trees. The next day, she walked alone to Abram's cabin near Bittyroot Ridge. It was a modest place, set back from the wind, with a barn of rough-hewn logs and a thin trail of smoke curling from the chimney. She knocked once and waited. He opened the door, sleeves rolled again, hands dusted with ash from the stove. "Galina," he said, surprised. "Something wrong?" "No." She stepped inside. "I wanted to see where you live." He moved aside and she entered. The room was spare but clean. A cot with a wool blanket in the corner, a rifle hung above the door. A pot simmered on the stove, and a half-whittled horse sat on the table near a knife and a block of pine. "You carve," she said. "Helps me think." She picked up the small horse, traced a finger along the unfinished mane. "I've thought about what you asked," she said. He didn't move. "About leaving?" "No, about what matters." She set the horse down. I want to build something lasting, here with someone who knows how to listen. He looked at her then, not rushed or startled, just steady. I don't have much, he said, but I'd give you all of it. She stepped closer. I don't need much, just a man who sees me clear. He reached for her hand, rough palm closing gently around her fingers. I've been waiting for you to say that. I know, she said and smiled. I just needed to be sure. He leaned down then, slow and certain, and the kiss they shared was quiet, like the first snow settling on warm ground, gentle, lasting, sure. Outside, the ridge stood watch and the wind turned soft against the pines. By late January, the cold had settled deep into the bones of the land. Even inside the store, where the stove burned nearly all day, Galina kept an extra shawl over her shoulders. She'd begun to close early, not from lack of business, but because the days ran short and the children needed more time in the lamplight to finish their lessons. Nathan had taken to reading aloud in the evenings, slow and halting but proud. Lottie pressed dried flowers into the pages of discarded ledgers, pinning color where winter had wiped it clean. Abram started coming by each Sunday with a new piece of lumber or a jar of something he'd preserved. He never made excuses for his visits. He didn't need to. Galina had moved the rocker beside the hearth to face the door, and she always kept a second cup warming on the stove. That Sunday, his coat was dusted in frost, and he carried a small box wrapped in oilcloth. Found something for you, he said as he stepped inside, stamping the cold from his boots. Galina set aside the mending she was doing. Is it another broken kettle? No, he said, fingers brushing damp from his brow. It's a clock, or it was. I fixed the gears. Thought maybe the children could use it to keep better time with their lessons. She took the box and opened it gently. Inside sat a small wood-cased mantel clock, the face faded but the hands ticking steady. Its ticking filled the quiet between them, soft and certain. They'll like this, she said. I will too. Abram glanced toward the corner where Nathan sat tracing a map of Montana territory with a charcoal nub. He keeps asking about places beyond the ridge. Wants to know what's west of Missoula. He asked me if Indians still live in the valley, Galina said. I told him yes, that not everything west of here belongs to us. Abram nodded. It's their land. Always was. Some folks pretend otherwise. You don't. I've seen enough to know the cost of pretending. Galina set the clock on the mantel. You ever think about where you'd be if you hadn't come here? I'd still be breathing, he said, but that's not the same as living. She turned toward him. Do you want to stay? He studied her face, not rushing. I do. Galina stepped closer, voice low. I've had proposals before, men who wanted a wife to keep quiet and tend chickens. I want a partner, he said. Someone whose steadiness I can lean on. Someone who sees the same quiet things I do and knows they matter. Her hand found his without hesitation. Then stay. Teach Nathan how to saddle a horse right. Help Lottie sew her first dress. Wake up beside me when the snow breaks and the ground begins to thaw. He lifted her hand to his chest, resting it over his heart. I'll stay. That night, she moved the children's cot into the wide back room and made space in the front bedroom for a second trunk. She didn't ask Abram when he'd bring his things. She didn't need to. The way he hung his coat on the peg beside hers told her everything, and when she banked the fire and turned down the lamp, she didn't feel alone in the dark. They were no longer waiting, they had arrived. By early spring, the snow had pulled back into the hollows, and the earth beneath Galina's boots had softened enough to carry the smell of damp roots and thawing bark. The store opened its doors wider now, letting light spill in over the floors she'd scrubbed raw. Lottie had taken to arranging the seed packets by color, while Nathan pored over a borrowed atlas, tracing trails with his fingertip. Abram had moved his things in slowly, never all at once. First a set of carving tools, then a folded pair of shirts, then a tin box filled with letters he never spoke of but kept tucked beneath the bed. He rose early without waking her, fed the chickens, hauled water, and by the time she stepped into her boots, he'd be by the stove, lifting the kettle with one hand and resting a steady touch on her back with the other. One Sunday after church, they walked the long way home along the creek's edge where the cottonwoods had started to bud. She carried her gloves in one hand, fingers chilled but bare. He walked beside her, quiet as always, until the church bell faded behind them. "I heard from my uncle," he said, voice low. "He's in Fort Benton now, says he's too old to run the last of the trap lines." Galina stepped over a patch of mud. "Does he want you to come?" "No, he wants to send me the deed to a cabin he kept west of the Milk River. Says he'd rather pass it to someone who knows how to mend more than just roofs." She paused. "Would you take it?" He shook his head once. "Not without you." She let that sit for a moment. "I've never seen the Milk River." "I have, but not the way I would now, not with you." Her hand found his. "Then maybe someday we go, but not yet," he nodded, thumb stroking over her knuckles. "Not yet." That night they sat on the porch after putting the children to bed, the stars sharp overhead. Abram had whittled a small bird from pine, its wings drawn close, its beak tilted upward. He held it out to her. "For the shelf," he said, "or the sill, maybe both." She turned it over in her palm, the grain warm from his touch. "You always work with your hands. Better than my mouth most days. You speak where it counts." He looked at her then, still and sure. "I want to marry you, Galina." Her breath caught not from surprise, but from the quiet certainty of it. "I don't need a preacher to know what I already have," she said. "But yes, I'd marry you." They wed in late April under the cottonwoods behind the store, with Reverend Cagle reading from a weather-soft Bible and Lottie clutching a bundle of wild plum blossoms. Nathan stood beside Abram, proud in a coat too big at the shoulders and a grin that didn't fit his usual reserve. Galina wore her mother's brooch pinned to her collar. Abram had trimmed his beard short and combed his hair back. The vows were simple. No grand words, no tears. Just steady voices speaking promises that had already begun in the quiet of shared bread and mended fences. Afterward, they served stew and cornbread behind the store, and neighbors who'd once whispered about Galina's silence now clapped her shoulder and pressed her hands. The children fell asleep curled together beneath a quilt, just as the last of the sunlight faded from the ridge. Later, in the hush of their room, Abram helped her unpin her hair. She turned toward him, the weight of the day still warm on her skin. "You're not what I expected when I first saw you," she said. "What did you expect? Someone passing through?" "Most men like you don't plant roots." He reached for her hand, pressing it over his chest. "You're the reason I stayed." They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. Years passed. Nathan grew tall and broad through the shoulders, and when he turned 17, he left for Helena to apprentice with a cartographer who'd once come through town. Lottie stayed by Galina's side, tending the store, gentle with customers and quick with numbers. She took to keeping ledgers in neat rows and stitching her own dresses from muslin and lace. Abram built a greenhouse beside the store with his own hands, planting herbs and berries come spring. Galina ran the front counter and stitched in the evenings, her fingers still steady, her heart still anchored. They never did take the cabin by the Milk River. They didn't need to. Their home quiet, weather-worn and warm, stood firm in Cold Creek. Through hard winters and long summers, through letters from afar and grandchildren underfoot, they stayed, together. And when the west wind shifted through the cottonwoods, it carried laughter, the scrape of a rocking chair, and the slow rhythm of a love not rushed, not grand, but full, earned. Steady and forever.